Hey friends, it's me, your girl Kristen Denise, also known as KD, here with another Today in Black History. And this one is pretty special, especially if you consider yourself politically involved kind of in any way. This is the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which took place on March 7th, 1965. So we are 60 years past the happenings of Bloody Sunday, which was pretty significant in the civil rights movement and played a critical role in the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which happened, I think, in August of 1965. We'll get into that. I'm trying to do this from memory, and your girl is tired, so yeah. But let's get into it. So on March 7th, 1965, 600 Black civil rights activists began a peaceful march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, during the demanding voting rights for Black Americans, right? And as they crossed the infamous now Edmund Pettus Bridge, Alabama state troopers and sheriff's deputies brutally attacked them with clubs, tear gas, and whips in the 1960s. The shocking violence was televised, causing national outrage and pushing President Lyndon B. Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Bloody Sunday was a turning point in the civil rights movement, proving that nonviolent protests could expose the cruelty of segregation. So let's get into it, okay? That's a little summary. So people are, well, what were they marching for? Like, why were they marching? So they were really fighting for voting rights in the South. In 1965, Black people in the South faced extreme voter suppression, even though we had the 15th Amendment that said we should be able to vote, right? Tactics like literacy tests, poll taxes, and just ultimately violence kept Black people from voting. So Selma, Alabama was one of the worst places at the time, and out of the 15,000 Black residents, only 355 were registered to vote. 355. Talk about like 2% basically of the Black population of Selma, Alabama at the time was registered to vote. Then you had the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson in February of 1965. Now, he was a 26-year-old Black man, and he was killed by Alabama state troopers during a peaceful voting rights protest. And this kind of enraged people locally. His death angered the civil rights movement leaders and inspired activists to march from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights. It wasn't just about Selma, but it was about ending voter suppression for Black Americans everywhere. So then you get to March 7th, 1965, and the march begins. 600 protesters led by John Lewis of SNCC, remember that's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Hosea Williams, random, if you watch The Real Housewives of Atlanta, that's Portia Williams' granddaddy, of the SCLC, which was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, left Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma, Alabama. The marchers were peaceful, they were unarmed, and they were determined to walk the 54 miles to Montgomery. If I'm walking 54 miles, no, I got something to say at the end of that. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a line of Alabama state troopers and white deputies waited on the other side. So now we get into the nitty gritty. Sheriff Jim Clark's officers and Alabama state troopers under Governor George Wallace, who was notoriously trifling for his thoughts and beliefs about Black people. And I said what I said. I don't care that he was the governor. He was horrendously racist and notoriously trifling. He's the one, I want to say George Wallace was the one who said segregation yesterday, segregation now, and segregation forever. No, sir. Another conversation for another day. And they were the protesters were ordered to stop their march, right? And when the marchers refused to stop, mind you, no weapons, peaceful protest, we just walking. They were violently attacked by the officers who initiated said attack. Tear gas filled the air, and the police rushed into the crowds. Men, women, and children were beaten with nightsticks and bullwhips. Horses trampled protesters who were trying to flee. John Lewis was struck in the head with a club, suffering a skull fracture. And many marchers were left unconscious, bleeding, and gasping for air. The attack was completely unprovoked, and the entire nation saw it unfold on live television. This sparked extreme outrage, not just in the U.S., but literally the world over, because how could you? Like, how dare you? America was shocked because they hadn't seen this level of violence up close everywhere, in particular in northern states. News stations broadcast the attack across the country, exposing the cruelty of Jim Crow. Photos of bloody, beaten marchers flooded newspapers, forcing Americans to see the reality of racism. How many times y'all got to see that reality, America? Martin Luther King Jr. then called for a second march. He led a symbolic march 2 days later on March 9th, but stopped at the bridge to avoid more violence. After that, President Lyndon B. Johnson was pressured to act because he had to see the brutality firsthand, just like the rest of the country. Bloody Sunday made it impossible for America to ignore the fight for Black voting rights. So, fast forward a couple weeks, on March 21st, 1965, under federal protection, 3,200 marchers now set out for Selma. By March 25th, their numbers had grown to 25,000. Wow. They successfully reached Montgomery, delivering their demands for voting rights. This victory led to the passing then of the Voting Rights Act later on that year. So the Voting Rights Act was signed into law on August 6, 1965 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. It banned literacy tests, poll taxes, and other voter suppression tactics. It gave the federal government power to monitor voting laws in racist states. We need that back. And Black voter registration skyrocketed, changing Southern politics forever. Without Bloody Sunday, we may not have gotten the Voting Rights Act. It may have never passed. What can we learn from Bloody Sunday today? Voting rights are still under attack. Still, right now, March 7th, 2025, 60 years later. We have to fight against modern voter suppression laws and voter intimidation tactics like strict ID laws, gerrymandering polling place closes, random voting place changes on the days of election. Looking at you, Texas. And we have to support organizations that are protecting voting rights like Black Voters Matter. We have to remember, nonviolent protests can expose injustice. Using social media, we can use our social media to expose racial injustice and to share what people are doing at polling places, things that are illegal. And peaceful protests still matter. When we see oppression, we have to react. Young people, we need you. We need young people in the fight. John Lewis was only 25 when he helped lead the march. Young activists are absolutely powerful, and we need you out here in this thing. Today's youth-led movements continue in his legacy, and we need to continue to see them show up and show out. Final thoughts on Bloody Sunday. It was one of the darkest days in American history, and America has had some dark days. Okay? But it led to one of the greatest victories of the civil rights movement. The marchers risked their lives to fight for justice. Their suffering really did force the nation to act, and their bravery changed voting rights, hopefully forever. But, let's be real about some of the things that we're facing. We must protect their legacy because the fight for voting rights isn't over. In the words of John Lewis, get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and redeem the soul of America. Unfortunately, again, 60 years later, her soul still needs some redeeming. And I have committed to be a part of the redemption. What about you? In all of this, remember, first and foremost, do what you need to do to be more than okay, because you deserve to be more than okay. And absolutely do what you need to do to live a life you love, because you absolutely deserve to live a life you love. Know that I love you, and I am here fighting, marching, protesting, and pushing for America to be who she claims to be for all of her citizens, especially those that look like you and me. All right? That's all I got. Love you. Bye.